Good afternoon. How are you all? Actually, thank you, Henry. It was a great introduction. Sometimes I was listening and said, God, he's summarizing some of the stuff we do better than I do. So, but thank you. It was a wonderful introduction. I'm going to talk about that a little bit. The reason I can talk about that is because of them. And so if you find things that you like and are intrigued by and want to think about again in the next little while we spend together, you should credit those folks, and one of them is here, my wife, Kimberly Gomez. And if you think what I'm about to say is boneheaded and doesn't deserve to be talked about again, you should also blame them. But let's move on a little bit. So I want to start by talking about what we've come to call the triple aims of education. We are failing to reach many, many students. So one might argue that we have to come to understand how to make the learning environments we build to become more relevant to them in their lives. We live in a knowledge-based economy that requires, as policymakers have recognized, ambitious learning for all students, and we have to learn how to move from an educational system that has been well suited to educating some to high levels to one that educates all at high levels. We live in a time where there's fierce competition for resources, and so we need to build more efficient systems. Even if our policy initiatives are able to attract more investments than they have heretofore, we aren't ever going to get all the money we need, so we have to learn how to educate people to high levels much more efficiently. So the triple aims of education, as we term them, are engagement, effectiveness, and efficiency. Now, the core question that I'd like to talk a little bit about is, in order to do that, we will have to figure out ways to use innovations and to become more innovative in our work. Because we should have the belief, or at least a naive belief, that if we are more innovative, we can change the opportunity equation in learning environments such that we are able to provide not merely access, but effective use at scale. It's often said that you can take almost any good idea and figure out how to make it work somewhere. And you can take some good ideas and figure out how to make them work with a few folks. But the real challenge is to take good ideas and have them work reliably for lots and lots of people. And we need to understand what can reliably work under diverse contexts. And we don't, I will argue, that have a social infrastructure that allows us to do so. Now, the conundrum is, if you look across the broad landscape of American life, innovations, many of them technological, have fundamentally transformed lots of sectors. Now, in our business, we have many, many good ideas that lots of important scholars, some of them here, have gotten us to think about. So things like 21st century skills, things of the sort that Henry and colleagues worked on for many years at ETS, and I imagine continue to work on, building better assessments that are both more efficient and more indicative at telling us what people know and can do. We have, as I and colleagues have worked on for a long time, understanding how communication technologies can better connect teachers and students and others to efficacious ends. But learning environments, if we were honest with ourselves, are not getting better fast enough, even though there is a persistent press in our business, a kind of dynamism around innovation. The learning environments we hope to build for all students are very slow in coming. if you take a look at the classrooms of the early 21st century, they kind of look like the classrooms of the early 20th. We've had an incredibly difficult time erasing systemic disadvantage. And as I said, we are plagued by islands of innovation, but not much innovation and transformation at scale. So why is that? We have argued that a key problem is variability in the following sense. There are broad mandates to use innovations of various sorts, but very little specificity about how to use innovations we create in diverse contexts. So it leads to, a kind of broad indictment that you can make particular in lots of different settings, where early adopters are able to do amazing things, create promise. Sometimes people from high-capacity organizations and homes are able to do amazing things with innovations. But oftentimes, as you go to more and more adopters, more diverse settings, innovations of a wide range of sorts, from one-to-one computing to techniques to help parents to read to children, often fall flat on their faces. One way that I often talk about this is we have a devil of a time filling the promise-practice gap. Jeff Pfeffer and Bob Sutton wrote a book called Trying to Fill the Knowing-Doing Gap, which is sort of, in their world, at the root of the promise-practice gap. So what is the knowing-doing gap? Huge amounts of policy time is often invested in figuring out how to fill the ignorance-knowledge gap. We often assume that the big problem is getting people to understand that something has to happen. So, for example, we invest a lot of policy effort in figuring out, helping people to know that we should be engaged in more formative assessment. Pfeffer and Sutton would argue that, yeah, that's a problem, but the bigger problem is investing lots of time and effort in helping people to know how to do formative assessment. So while the ignorance-knowledge gap is important, the real issue in solving the promise-practice gap is the knowing-doing gap. So how do we turn variability from a roadblock to a resource? Is the sort of the thing that I'd like to have us talk about for a little bit. And in the spirit of talking about it for a little bit, if you have questions, you could ask them as we go along. And if I feel like I'm going to get there in the talk, I'll tell you that. And if I feel like I can't answer that now, if you'll indulge me, I'll tell you that too. So if you have, you can raise questions if you like, and I'd be happy to deal with them as I can. So for the rest of the time, I want to talk about the problem of sustaining innovation. And I want to place a spin on that as a problem of redisciplining perceptions. As an example, and then I want to sort of move to two examples. One example is a program we call Summer Connections that at the University of Pittsburgh we worked on over 2 summers. And then I want to talk about the core of this talk is talking about the problem of building networked improvement communities. And I want to give an example of work that I and colleagues at the Carnegie Foundation for the Advancement of Teaching are working on, trying to address the crisis in developmental mathematics in the United States. And then we'll have maybe a few reflections before we go to the reception. Innovation in education. If you scratch most people who work in schools and other places where people learn, most professionals, they'll tell you that our innovations from the research community are mostly a distraction. They're a distraction because they are often very episodic, terribly focused on establishing effects, trying to figure out what works. They are often solo enterprises, things done in small teams or things done by just a few people working in silos. And they are dominated by what one might refer to as I thinking. Scratch any academic, And the academic will say to you, so what are you interested in? And the academic will say, I'm interested in doing X. Rarely do we say that we are interested in solving some problem. So, and we ought to be working toward what we might refer to as we thinking. And I'd like to come later in this talk talking about ways to engender we thinking among diverse colleagueships. But we thinking requires coordination. And to improve educational problems, we've got to work on how things work. And in addition to talking about that they work, we need to figure out how to work on continuously improving them. And the core problem is the problem of continuous knowledge accumulation. If you haven't seen it, I think in the most recent issue of ER, Educational Researcher, there's a paper by Anna Norris and Jim Hebert, and where they talk this particular, and it's a really wonderful paper on this problem of knowledge accumulation. Their core argument is that an important part of the business of being in education is building artifacts and routines where knowledge can accumulate around. So an example of such a routine in their world is the continuous improvement of lesson study. Lesson study is a routine, and deepening knowledge happens around lesson study as an activity. So I highly recommend that to your reading. So in doing that, context matters. The context of our experiences disciplines our perceptions, is what I want us to kind of think about. Our experiences help us understand what's possible and how to see our futures. And the core, one core idea for me is that without help, we see the world the way we saw it before. So one of the jobs of an educational research and development infrastructure is to help practitioners of all sorts to see new worlds, and we need innovations to do that, and I think those innovations will ultimately be of the social sort that I'll talk about in a bit. But to put you sort of collectively in touch with this, consider this. Maybe some people here, especially the cognitive psychologists among you, have seen this before. And if you've seen it before, indulge me and don't tell your friends yet. So take a look at that and think about what you see. What I suggest you could see is that, a cow. And the point is, now and forever, when you see that, you'll see a cow. And the point is your perception of that has been disciplined in this way. Lest you think that it's just a cheap perceptual trick, look at this. This is a picture of the Phelps 1901 tractor. And I want to draw your attention to one thing in particular. This is the steering mechanism for that tractor. And what is that? It's reins. So the first way to envision steering and controlling a tractor was imported from the last technology that people had for such things. So one more example. This, I'll show you, is a commercial that the Cisco company put out, and before I show it, and I'm obviously probably going to critique it, but I don't mean to bash Cisco because I think they're a wonderful company and terribly innovative, but still, they helped me make the point. What do you notice about the new classroom? It looks a lot like the old classroom. And again, the people at Cisco are terribly innovative, but their perceptions of what is possible is disciplined as all of our perceptions are by what we've experienced. So what we see is disciplined by the experiences and the places and systems we find ourselves. And innovation, implementation today is dominated by what you might, by compartmentalized, Taylorist, factory floor modeled views of how organizations work. We argue that researchers create great ideas, policymakers vet them, and then require that practitioners engage in them. In truth, research, most of what we do, is largely good at vetting disciplinary-based theories, not good at coming up with practice-based theories. Policy is mostly removed from practice, so removed that it's hard to mandate, and practitioners, by and large, resent being told by policymakers what to do. So I think this model is wrong both in flow, and this model is wrong in conceptualization, because what should happen is much more dynamic interaction among these segments of the knowledge economy to produce innovation, rather than the simple feed-forward model that dominates much of how innovation makes its way from research into practice, if it ever does. So to give an example of how this unfolds first, and how it might unfold second, first I'll talk about what kind of happens traditionally, and I'll use our work to do that. A couple years ago, we created a program called Summer Connections at the University of Pittsburgh and we created it in collaboration with Pittsburgh Public Schools. What Summer Connections was a 2-week program designed for University Prep is a school that Kim, myself, and others have been helping to start in Pittsburgh for incoming freshmen grades 6 to 10. It took place on the university's campus, which we thought was important to help students understand what universities are about and how work unfolds in them. I mean, many students of the sort that we seek to serve live, as they do in Pittsburgh, in very close proximity to the University of Pittsburgh and to CMU, walk by those places all the time, and really don't have a clue what goes on inside. So we thought it was important for our program to take place on our campus. We provided summer experiences of an academic sort focused around themes like sports and nutrition, medicine, and robotics. And we also thought of this as an opportunity for professional development for teachers in order to see and observe students that they would teach in the fall, observed in activities that look different than normal school activities with different patterns of engagement. And the hope is that seeing them work differently would then change their practice. We wanted to grow an intellectual culture. We wanted students to take on the role of designers and researchers. We wanted to embed technology in activities. We wanted this to be an example of culture building, where students could make work public, have a safe place for critique, revision, and collaboration. And we wanted opportunities for teachers to see their students work differently. Students, we had 50, in the 2 sessions we had somewhat over 100 students. 13 students wanted to come to both sessions. And we, even though that wasn't part of what we planned to take place, students did things like robotics. They gathered air quality around various places around our campus, investigated the causes, and used vocabulary associated with air quality in their work. They interviewed environmental and medical experts in the field of air quality as part of the work. There was consistent attendance in this program. The work was observed by more than 20 teachers. We created a big, long file that we call a file of bright moments, sort of capturing how students performing well. And our only requirement was that every student who was part of this program had to have at least one bright moment to sort of document students performing well. We had, for us, what were important community outcomes. 8 university departments and 3 organizations outside the university were integral in making this program come to life. There were public culminating receptions for student work attended by parents, relatives, neighborhood leaders, and district leaders, and university staff. the point of doing this was that the district expected recovery money and was then going to create a program based on information from this program that was going to go district-wide. And they did that, but what they did was create a program that attended to the surface features of the innovation we intended. So the summer program was half academic, half physical activity. It used a bunch of technology. But the cultural goals that were at the root of what we tried to do were not really present in the program that the district fielded. So there's really no connection to summer work to the school year. There were no professional development opportunities for teachers, and there were really no public displays of work. So this, I argue, is not a district problem at its core. This, I argue, at its core was our problem. We created, inadvertently, and replicated a core flaw in technology transfer, that is, transfer itself. We sort of created an environment where, in theory, we built, they take. We didn't make a world where we build together, that is, researchers and designers in the university along with district people and others. We didn't have a diverse colleagueship carrying out the work, so there was no shared design table. And we underspecified what we were making. We weren't clear what Summer Connections was. Without some effort, it was very easy for folks to see it as a technology summer program, for example. And we weren't clear about what it was about what we were doing that represented progress. So, in a sense, we failed to rediscipline perception. We needed a better mechanism for social learning. And there was no systematic thinking about how to solve, we didn't engage in any systematic thinking about how to solve the social coordination problem. So, in many ways, what we did is what often academics do engaged in work like this. We created a program that, on implementation in the hands of others, failed to reach the promise we had in mind. And, in another world, in another time, we would look at what happened as what some scholars refer to as a fatal mutation. Well, it wasn't a fatal mutation. What we did was we created an impoverished environment for social learning. So we want to, in the work I'm going to talk about next, while the domain is different, the domain is certainly different, but the approach is very different, and we think that the approaches that we are now taking at least hold a promise, there's that word again, for better redisciplining of perception through social learning. And at its core, we're sort of talking about a coordination problem and seeing coordination differently. So any innovation, Summer Connections or anything else you'd like to think of, I think, can be, one way it can be described is by its audiences. So it has audiences like state legislatures, policy advocates, audiences like principals and teachers, audiences like researchers and designers. And those audiences have things they think about normally. They think about tools, they think about practice, they think about rules and regulations, and they tend to think about them in the silos of what they do. The big challenge for those of us who would like to build sustainable innovations is to get them to think together. And so the problem we'd like to try to address is structuring a diverse colleagueship for improvement. In a paper that some people here have read, that Tony Bright, Alicia Gradau, and I wrote, we got many of the ideas that I'm about to talk to you about by doing a relatively in-depth analysis of several real-world exemplars of organizations building these diverse colleagueships. And the organizations themselves are as diverse as the semiconductor industry that has built the semiconductor, among other things, their semiconductor industry roadmap, which is, if you've not heard about it, is a social and technical innovation that coordinates the activities of scientists, engineers, marketeers across companies that sometimes collaborate and sometimes compete. But they can all rely on the roadmap to tell them how innovations will be staged for entry into the laboratory and into the marketplace. Another similar example is the Linux system, made up of a loose confederation of software designers, but have the Linux system itself and its rules for creation as an organizing factor so that diverse people can work together on the creation of software and be convinced that if they work together, the systems themselves will work. Probably our most profound insights came from the Institute for Healthcare Improvement right up the road in Cambridge, where they have worked on the problem of solving errors in medical practice. Some people here are old enough to remember complications. Remember complications? When people would go to hospital and other places and bad things would happen and folks would say, well, it was a complication. Well, what's a complication? A complication is an error. And if you confront it as an error, a systems error, that you might be able to begin to create modifications in the system so that errors that theory and practice at least would give you to believe should be impossible actually become impossible. They become what people in the medical world call never events. And so certain things like they've worked on problems like organizing medical professionals across hospitals and other organizations to drive central line infections to zero, for example, something that the technology exists and the practice exists if you just had the social mechanisms to make them happen. So we learned a bunch about how to build these improvement organizations from studying other organizations that seem to accomplish it. We also learned a huge amount from the work of Doug Engelbart to get this done. How many people here have heard of Doug Engelbart in your travels? Doug Engelbart, I think, is an American treasure. Douglas Engelbart is an American treasure. What he accomplished over the course of a very long working career, I think he's in his 80s now, he was in the 1950s when the very first ideas about artificial intelligence burst onto the scene. And one way to think about it is artificial intelligence spawned two children. One of the children was the artificial intelligence we see around the replication of intelligent behavior in computers. Pat Suppies, Marvin Minsky, those folks. Another strand of artificial intelligence, and the first strand has been incredibly productive, by the way, a lot of important research and scholarship. The second strand is the intelligence augmentation strand, which Doug Engelbart and colleagues at SRI invented. So among the things that we use today that Engelbart invented is the mouse. He invented the idea of markup languages to take, I'm blocking on his name, but to bring hypertext to life. In his 70s, he started a new organization called the Bootstrap Institute that rather than working on hardware-software technologies to augment intelligence, he wanted to work on social technologies to do so. And one of the key innovations from that part of his very long, innovative life was sort of multiple level models for learning for improvement. So in Doug Engelbart's language, these are multi-level models that help us learn how to get better at getting better. And so his conception is that almost all organizations can be conceptualized as having three kinds of opportunities to learn. There's what he refers to as level A learning. And level A learning is the kind of learning that happens on the ground in the business of the organization. So in teaching and learning organizations, level A learning is what goes on in classrooms between teachers and students. And then he would argue that those level A learning opportunities can be disciplined by level B learning. And level B learning is the kind of learning that takes place because you're trying to make level A better. So organizations like in school districts that do level B learning are people like institutional or district research organizations. They collect data where that data is meant to be fed back in the classrooms to help level A learning get better. But his real sort of innovation, I should say that in education today, I think we need to learn how to get better at level B as well, but his real innovation is level C learning, creating relationships among these A-B dyads. So you have what amounts to parallel A-B activities across different organizations. In this case, you could read different school districts, maybe. And you have mechanisms for sharing the work that different A-B dyads do, so they can get to inform across organizations the kinds of activities they engage in to get better at problems they might share. And we think that if you look at the work of the semiconductor industry, Linux, and others, there's a way to see that they not only accomplish important level B learning, but they put together infrastructures to make it possible for level C learning. And we think that level C learning is absolutely crucial to become a learning organization to get from I to we. And we believe that there are at least 4 components that we identified in our analysis of people like the semiconductor industry and IHI and Linux that lead to this. One is that organizations that do well at getting better have a colleagueship committed to specific solving or making progress on specific problems of practice. Second, they have shared and feasible targets. That is, they commit to working on a problem and they're convinced that they have the theoretical underpinnings to make progress on that problem. So to be distinguished here, if you think about in our business, we're really fond of setting targets, but often we don't have the theoretical underpinnings and machinery to convince us that the targets we set are feasible. So if you think about NCLB as a case in point, having a target that all children will read by grade 3 in some year, it's a great target to set. But no one, even when the target was initially specified, no one was convinced that we could reach it. And part of the reason they weren't convinced that we could reach it is that there wasn't a lot of theory and a lot of experience that convinced us the target was feasible. Third thing you need are analytic tools that you share. And what analytic tools buy you is a common language to talk about the problem. And finally, we think these organizations have shared inquiry protocols. So they have shared measurement. They know when they're making progress on a problem because they have shared ways to dig into the problem and shared things to come out of it. The work that we're doing in community colleges is our attempt, in our language, to do a learning by doing exercise. We want to take a problem that's really important in the world of education and try to learn how to become one of these level C learning institutions. And the problem we take is working on developmental mathematics in community colleges. Let me stop here. When I say developmental math in community colleges, does everyone understand what I'm talking about? So the developmental math problem in community colleges is a problem that, in caricature, is something like this. Not too rough a caricature, actually. In Allegheny County, where I work right now, there's Allegheny County Community College, and roughly 75% of every student who leaves a high school in Allegheny County with a diploma, not just from Pittsburgh Public Schools, but the whole county, who shows up on the doorstep of Allegheny County Community College, are asked to take a test. This test is one of two tests. One is called the Accuplacer, and the other is called Compass. And based on the results of that test, students are told that they either are ready to take college-level mathematics courses or not. They're also told whether or not they're able to take college-level English language arts courses as well, but college-level mathematics courses. And somewhere around 75% of all those students are told they aren't ready. And these are people, you got to be clear who we're talking about here. We're talking about people that somebody else gave a diploma to. And this is a kind of crisis in, I think, in American education. It's a crisis that the president recognizes and others recognize. Because community colleges are an incredible engine in our society for societal transformation. Oftentimes, the NSF and others invest huge amounts of money in so-called pipeline things. And we will spend, millions of dollars, and it's not too pejorative to say, we'll spend millions of dollars to try to create 10, 20 more PhDs in biochemistry. Now, that's an important thing, 10 or 20 more PhDs in biochemistry. But I think that this is an intergenerational problem. Before you create a lot of new PhDs in biochemistry, you probably need to have an infrastructure that's going to create a lot of new phlebotomists and other kinds of people who work in healthcare, in hundreds of other industries, and it is their children who will be the next engine for all those biochemists. And community colleges are one of the ways that people gain entry into that trajectory. So that we are failing, many of them, is an incredible shame. My colleague, Uri Treisman at the University of Texas, says that developmental mathematics is the place, developmental education in general, is the place where dreams go to die. And and it's true. When you have that kind of failure rate, he reported the other day at a meeting we had that in many community colleges, many students who would take these developmental math sequences are taking the same course for the fourth and fifth time. And these are courses that are teaching them things like fractions and so forth. Arithmetic reasoning. So here, these things are 3 or 4 course long sequences. The content is oriented over the cycle to get students prepared to take calculus and ultimately to go on to STEM careers. No one ever goes on to STEM, really. And only about 30% of the kids, young people, I shouldn't call them kids, young people, or in some cases not so young people who start these sequences ever get out of them. And as I said, almost no one who gets out of them ever goes on to a STEM-like career. So when faced with a problem like that in our world, what happens? Well, when faced with a problem like that, some people clearly say, well, it's the textbooks. Got to have better textbooks. And so if that's true, we need open source materials. Other people faced with a problem like that will say, well, clearly it's student motivation. So we need to build learning communities for students. Other people faced with a problem like that, so we're really not aligning our students with academic and career goals. So what do we need? We need to design more meaningful courses. Still, others will say, well, it's a human resource problem. Well, if it's a human resource problem, clearly we need professional development. And then still others will say, clearly it's a leadership failure. So we need leadership development programs. Well, the answer here, not surprisingly, it's not any one of these, it's all of these. And the challenge is, how do you create environments where all of these problems can be kept in view at the same time while you're trying to work through a solution? So our approach here is to be problem-centered. And the way we're problem-centered is that, I think I get to this, I won't say this now. We're problem-centered, We try to work with measurable targets. We carry out the work through a network. And the work is anchored in continuous improvement. And finally, we try to organize the work around a common inquiry framework so there can be continuous cycles of improvement. Concretely, what we're doing is building a community collaboratory made up of 23 innovative community colleges that belong to organizations like Achieving the Dream. And these community colleges, along with other partners, are working to build what we call the Statway Collaborative. The Statway Collaborative, our overarching goal is to build a pathway that gets students, in our language, to and through developmental mathematics in one continuous year of study. And so what we hope will happen is that in one continuous year of study, they will cover the material that goes on in developmental mathematics and get one college-level course credit in statistics. So we're using statistics and probabilistic reasoning as the backdrop to help students make it through the developmental math sequence. So there are these colleges in 5 states. Critically, we have cross-campus representation in this community college collaboratory. So there are faculty, administration, and institutional research members to add to make a diverse colleagueship. And we are trying in our work to establish the base state social arrangements that can sustain an innovation where that innovation is the Statway program. To do so, we're trying to work on those 4 problems I mentioned earlier. And I'll talk about each of them. And the way I will do it is to contrast what the building of a networked improvement community looks like with the building and activity of communities of practice, something that many of us who work in education know very well and are fond of. So on the problem of contrasting communities of practice around targets and networked improvement communities, communities of practice are loose and broad. They're great at sharing ideas. In fact, they're kind of idea bazaars, but they have weak mechanisms for directing intentional action. Whereas networked improvement communities, the way Engelbart viewed them and the way we view them, are aimed at a common complex product, and they have rules and norms for participation. On the problem of shared and feasible targets, communities of practice share a common interest. Communities of practice are great at catalyzing discussion, but rarely share common outcomes. Networked improvement communities share targets that are feasible and measurable. They too catalyze discussion, but targets maintain focus, and targets can be adjusted over time based on the reality of experience. Analytic tools, I'll talk about 2. Here, taking from the work of the semiconductor industry, we built a thing called a program improvement map, which allows people in the entire collaboratory, so researchers, administrators, faculty, institutional researchers in community colleges, to see the system in which they're working. So it coordinates efforts, provides multiple perspectives, displays targets over time, is part of creating a common language, and it's a framework for accumulating knowledge from the field. Well, I don't expect you to read this whole thing, but this is the program improvement map we created to think about bringing the Statway program to a set of community colleges. And it's important to see that we've broken the system up in multiple ways. We've broken it up by level, things that happen in classrooms, things that happen in institutions, and things that happen in fields, and also the kind of subsystems that make the world work. Human resource subsystem, instructional subsystem, information infrastructure, student support subsystem, and governance. So what all this means, in order to have something like the Statway work in a community college, it's not just a faculty problem. It's a problem it's a problem that institutional researchers have to face. It's a problem that administrators have to face in very granular ways. So, for example, we know from research that it is highly predictive in developmental mathematics courses how students will do. It's highly predictive. Their first 3 weeks in class will predict a lot about how they're going to do at the end of the class. If you know that, what do you do? Well, maybe one of the things you do is get the institutional research organization to publish data about how the first 3 weeks are unfolding. You get administrators to make it possible for institutional research organizations to measure aspects of the first 3 weeks of behavior. The point is that for something like Statway to unfold, it's a big coordination problem that a system has to act on. A second analytic tool is something called the driver diagram. And let me back up. The driver diagram we take from the work of the world of improvement research or improvement science. And that's a collection of knowledge that initially grew out of the work of the quality improvement world, originally sort of energized by the work of Deming and others like Duran. And one of the core tools that world uses is something called the driver diagram. And the driver diagram has 3 key elements. It has targets, primary drivers, and secondary drivers. And here's a piece of the driver diagram that's driving our work in Statway. So we have a core target that is doubling the number of students who earn college credit in math within 1 year of continuous enrollment. The people at IHI here in Cambridge taught us that and also when we've worked with others around this problem, one of the hardest things for people concerned with improvement to engage in is setting aims or targets that are precise. They have a phraseology there. They say, soon is not a time and some is not a number. So you got to have a concrete goal. And so the primary drivers are sort of your theory about the primary causes, in this case, of high failure rate. Like you lose students, large numbers of students at the transition between classes, which is true. So one way you do it is you eliminate the transitions themselves. So the secondary drivers are the things that you can gain control of. So if you make a continuous enrollment course or a pathway, you believe you have some effect on losing students at the transition. You just get rid of choice. And you have students' beliefs and attitudes are undermining their motivation. Then you work on psychosocial support for students and so forth. But the real point of a driver diagram is it allows a community, not just individuals, but a community to make their theory of change much more visible. And finally, we've learned from the world of improvement science the idea of creating shared protocols. And I want to get you to see what I'm talking about as a mode of inquiry. Think about the way traditional translational research is done, where there are often discipline-based theories, methodological rigor, things like RCTs to help establish effects, and trying to work on the problem of implementation with fidelity, and then working on the problem of adaptive integration. So that's sort of the classic translational model of research that we all live with. And counterposed to that is the action research model of inquiry, which is individual or small group practitioners at the center. It's highly contextualized inquiry. It's highly localized improvement, but very, very weak mechanisms for accumulation and transfer. We hope that the work that we're engaged in is kind of a third way, a science of improvement, which tries to focus on a fleet of what you might call coordinated inquiries across organizations, that sort of the level C thing, practical measurement and design, analyzing variability, taking on variability as a problematized challenge, looking for what works for whom and under what set of circumstances, and a dynamic strategy for accumulating knowledge and improving together. One way to think about this is having the work organized by 4 questions. which is how do we understand the problem we seek to address, so thinking in systems. What specifically are we trying to accomplish, targets. What change might we try to introduce, in this case a solution pathway, and how will we know, what's the evidence that the change we introduce is in fact an improvement. And one way to organize that work that people who work in sort of quality assurance and improvement often do is think in terms of PDSA cycles, or plan, do, study, act cycles, where in the plan phase you analyze causes and you assess the current system. In the do phase you explicate hypothesis and try out sort of a small improvement protocol. And here by small, you could mean to ask 4 or 5 teachers to try something new. You measure the outcomes, you analyze the results, and then you sort of relate them to the problem, and you revise and refine. And so you have iterative tests. So it gives you an infrastructure for iterative test of change, where these kind of cycles are at the core. You start with hunches and theories, and then you engage in multiple PDSA cycles that you think lead to sort of change result, the changes that result in improvement. You start with very small tests of change on a really small scale, just with a few people. You have follow-up tests, wide-scale test of change, and then you have implementation of a change at scale. And the goal of work like this is to have multiple systems of improvement cycles going on at the same time, so you have a network engaged in forms of improvement research and who share their work across their organizations. In theory, the belief we are engaged in about this work tries to energize the wisdom of crowds, where the belief is that we accomplish together more than even the best of us can accomplish alone. So for us, the questions ahead are many. The work we've done to date is really all about just developing an infrastructure to engage in this kind of improvement research across multiple organizations. But we have not scratched the surface in trying to understand how you evangelize leadership for work like this, because, I mean, in some sense, you've got to draw people to it. We've not done any work trying to understand how do you manage the conversation between micro and macro dynamics. Everything I've talked to you about is all about micro dynamics, what goes on in classrooms, what goes on in individual institutions. But policy change both occurs from the top down and the bottom up, and we've not spent any time working on that negotiation. The work that we're talking about doing is not work that we expect to own. We expect to build a thing like catalyze a thing like the Statway Collaborative, and the Statway itself will own the work and govern itself, so we have to understand how to engage in the problem of evolving governance. If this work is successful, the Statway Collaborative will produce valuable intellectual products, and in the production of those products, they should produce a revenue that sustains them, but we need to figure out a licensing structure to collect and disseminate that revenue. So these are sort of 4 of probably very many questions that a scheme like building these networked improvement communities have to solve. The point of having this conversation today, having this talk, was really not in the first position to talk about Statway per se, but to engage us all in thinking about, well, are we really laying the groundwork for getting better at getting better? And we think, perhaps, that we've gained some insights for problems like the Statway, that if to make progress, you have to come to own a common problem. You have to have a supportive context for innovators and early adopters. You have to establish base state organizational arrangements, core group that shares common goals, and participation agreements that are institution-wide, and you have to have what you consider consider to be cross-institutional participation. And with these as the sort of the groundwork, we believe that lots of organizations can begin to attack lots of what heretofore are thorny problems. So I want to close with a quote from the quintessential Taylorist, Henry Ford, but it's still appropriate. Henry Ford said that coming together is the beginning, keeping together is progress, but working together is a success. And the work I tried to talk to you about today is the beginnings of establishing social infrastructures to allow diverse colleagueships to work together. Thank you.